As he passed the humble farmer, the millionaire was frozen at the sight of her pendant. The same one his daughter wore when she disappeared 25 years ago. The late afternoon sun poured through the large windows of Richard Thompson's office, casting long shadows on the polished mahogany desk. The golden light illuminated shelves lined with accolades and photographs of business milestones. But none of it held any meaning for him anymore. For years, Richard had buried himself in work, turning his pain into success. Yet no amount of wealth could fill the gaping void left in his heart. He leaned back in his leather chair, clutching a small framed photograph. It was worn from years of handling. A snapshot of a young girl with chestnut hair and a wide, innocent smile. Her name was Olivia, his daughter, who had vanished during a family vacation at their Texas ranch 15 years ago. The pain of that day was a permanent scar, one that no amount of time or effort could erase. The police investigation back then had been exhaustive but fruitless. Every possible lead turned cold, leaving nothing but unanswered questions and sleepless nights. Desperate for answers, Richard had hired the best private investigators, sparing no expense, but even their efforts led only to despair. The ranch, once a cherished family retreat, became a haunting reminder of his failure to protect Olivia. He sold the property shortly after her disappearance, unable to set foot on its grounds again. Richard placed the photo back on his desk and ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. His assistant's voice broke through the intercom, pulling him back to the present. "Mr. Thompson, your plane is ready. Your plane. The driver is downstairs to take you to the airstrip." "Thank you, Lisa. I'll be down shortly," he replied, his voice steady, masking the storm within. This trip to California wasn't something he'd planned, but circumstances had forced his hand. A problem at one of his smaller agricultural investments, a farm producing organic apples, needed his attention. Normally, he would delegate this kind of task, but something about the opportunity to escape his suffocating routine felt oddly appealing. Perhaps the quiet of the countryside would give him a reprieve from the memories that haunted him daily. Hours later, Richard arrived at the farm. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of freshly turned soil and blooming wildflowers. Rows of apple trees stretched out as far as the eye could see, their fruit hanging heavy on the branches. The pastoral scene was peaceful, almost therapeutic, yet it also felt foreign to a man who thrived in the concrete jungles of big cities. He stepped out of the sleek black SUV, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel. The farm manager, an older man with sun-weathered skin named Tom, greeted him warmly. "Mr. Thompson, it's good to see you. We've had a few hiccups with production, but nothing we can't handle. I'll give you a full report in my office." Richard nodded, following Tom toward the barn. As they walked, his gaze wandered to the workers scattered across the fields. Men and women moved among the trees, their hands quick and practiced as they plucked apples and loaded them into wooden crates. It was then that his eyes landed on a young woman standing a few rows away. Something about her posture caught his attention, an air of quiet determination. She turned her head slightly, revealing a face that was striking in its simplicity. Freckles dotted her sun-kissed skin, and strands of auburn hair escaped the braid tied loosely at her back. But what truly held Richard's focus was the glint of a silver chain around her neck. Hanging from it was a small pendant shaped like a crescent moon. His breath caught for a moment. The world seemed to tilt. That pendant. It was identical to the one Olivia had been wearing the day she disappeared. Richard's mind raced, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. Could it be a coincidence? Or was fate finally offering him a clue? "Tom?" Richard said abruptly, interrupting the farm manager mid-sentence. "Who's that young woman over there?" Tom squinted in the direction Richard was pointing. "Oh, that's Emily. She's one of our seasonal workers. Hard worker, keeps to herself mostly." Richard nodded, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to meet her. Can you arrange that?" Tom hesitated, slightly puzzled, but agreed. "Of course. I'll call her over." Minutes later, Emily approached, carrying a basket of apples. Up close, Richard noticed the pendant gleaming against her collarbone, its intricate design unmistakable. She stopped a few feet away, her gaze steady but cautious. "Mr. Thompson," Tom introduced. "This is Emily. Emily, this is Mr. Thompson, the owner of the farm." Emily wiped her hands on her jeans before extending one to Richard. "Pleasure to meet you, sir." Richard shook her hand, his grip firm but distracted. Likewise, that's a beautiful necklace you're wearing. May I ask where you got it? Emily instinctively touched the pendant, her brow furrowing slightly. Oh, this. I've had it for as long as I can remember. It's all I have from my childhood. A woman gave it to me when I was little, but I don't really know much about it. Her words sent a chill down Richard's spine. His instincts screamed that this pendant was more than just a trinket. It was a thread to the past he thought he'd lost forever. The words lingered in Richard's mind long after Emily walked away. It's all I have from my childhood. Her voice, calm and honest, carried a weight that stirred something deep within him. Standing in the middle of the apple orchard, he watched her retreating figure as she returned to the rows of trees. Basket in hand, the pendant swung slightly with each step she took, catching the sunlight and flashing like a signal begging to be followed. Tom cleared his throat, snapping Richard out of his trance. Something on your mind, Mr. Thompson? Richard glanced at the older man, hesitating for a moment before shaking his head. No, nothing. Let's get back to the office. I'd like to go over the reports. Of course, Tom said, though his tone hinted at curiosity. He led Richard toward a modest wooden building near the barn. But Richard's thoughts remained in the field, fixed on Emily and her crescent moon pendant. Inside the office, Tom laid out documents detailing the farm's production challenges, equipment malfunctions, supply chain delays, and unexpected weather patterns. Richard listened with half an ear, nodding at intervals. But his mind wandered back to Emily. There was no denying it now. The resemblance between her pendant and Olivia's was too precise to ignore. Every detail, from the delicate silver filigree to the faint engraving on the back, matched his memory perfectly. Mr. Thompson? Tom's voice pulled him back to the present. Did you hear what I said about the irrigation system? Yes, I heard, Richard replied briskly, though he hadn't registered a word. I'll approve the necessary expenses to fix it. Just send the breakdown to my office. Tom raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Will do. Anything else you'd like to discuss? No, Richard said, standing abruptly. I'd like to walk around the property again, if you don't mind. Be my guest, Tom replied, still puzzled by Richard's distracted demeanor. Richard stepped outside, the fresh air filling his lungs as he took in the sprawling orchard once more. The workers were still busy among the trees, their chatter carried by the breeze. Emily was further down the row now, her basket almost full. Without overthinking, Richard made his way toward her. She noticed him approaching and straightened, brushing her hands on her jeans again. Back so soon, Mr. Thompson, she said with a small smile. Do you always take such a hands-on approach with your farms? Richard chuckled lightly, though his mind was racing. Not usually, but this place feels different, peaceful. I thought I'd get to know the people who make it run so well. Emily shrugged, her expression modest. Well, I'm just a seasonal worker. Nothing too special about me. He tilted his head, studying her. I wouldn't say that. You seem hardworking, focused, and that necklace. He gestured toward the pendant. You said it was given to you when you were little. Do you remember anything about who gave it to you? Emily hesitated, her fingers instinctively gripping the pendant. Not really. I grew up in an orphanage and I don't remember much before that. A woman dropped me off there one night and handed this to the caretaker. That's all I know. Richard's chest tightened. The timeline matched. Olivia had disappeared 15 years ago, and Emily appeared to be in her early 20s. Could it be possible? Could this young woman, standing in front of him with such quiet strength, truly be his daughter? That's unusual, Richard said carefully, masking his emotions. Did you ever try to find out more about her, the woman who brought you there? Emily shook her head. Not really. I mean, I was a kid, and once I grew up, I figured it didn't matter. The past is the past. Right. Richard's jaw tightened at her words. For her, the past might be a closed chapter, but for him, it was a wound that never healed. He couldn't leave this as just a coincidence. Have you ever thought about where you came from? He pressed gently. About your family. Emily frowned slightly, a mix of curiosity and wariness crossing her face. Why are you so interested, Mr. Thompson? Richard hesitated, realizing he was treading on thin ice. He couldn't risk scaring her away, not before he had answers. I'm just curious. It's rare to meet someone with such an interesting story. Emily nodded slowly, her expression softening. Well, to be honest, I don't think about it much. Life has enough challenges as it is, you know. Richard offered a small smile. I understand, but sometimes the past has a way of finding us, whether we're ready for it or not. Before Emily could respond, Tom called out to her from across the field. Emily, we've got another shipment to pack up. She sighed, giving Richard an apologetic glance. Duty calls. It was nice talking to you, Mr. Thompson. You too, Emily, he replied, watching as she walked away once more, as she disappeared among the trees. Richard's resolve hardened. He couldn't let this go. Emily might not have any answers, but there were other ways to uncover the truth. He would contact his private investigator immediately, digging into every detail of her past. If there was even the slightest chance she was connected to Olivia, he would stop at nothing to find out. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of hope. A dangerous, intoxicating hope that perhaps, just perhaps, his search for Olivia wasn't over. The quiet hum of the car engine filled the air as Richard sat in the back seat of the sleek black SUV, his phone pressed to his ear. The image of Emily and her crescent moon pendant was burned into his mind, refusing to fade even as the scenery of rolling hills and apple orchards blurred past the window. I need you to pull all the records you can find on her, Richard said firmly. His voice was steady, but his fingers tapped anxiously against the leather seat. Her name is Emily. She's in her early 20s and grew up in an orphanage. Start there. On the other end of the line, his trusted private investigator. James Calloway sighed. Richard, I've handled a lot of tough cases for you, but this is a shot in the dark. Are you sure there's anything to find? I'm sure, Richard replied, his jaw tightening. Her necklace is identical to the one Olivia wore when she disappeared. It's not a coincidence. James hesitated before responding. All right, I'll dig into it, but don't get your hopes up too high. You've been down this road before. Richard ended the call without replying, his gaze turning back to the passing landscape. He had heard James's warning countless times over the years, but this felt different. This time, he couldn't shake the feeling that fate was pulling at a thread he had been chasing for over a decade. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Richard toured the farm's facilities, met with employees, and approved plans for improvements, but his mind remained elsewhere. By evening, he found himself back at the farmhouse that served as temporary accommodations for visiting managers. The rustic charm of the place did little to ease his restless thoughts. Sitting in the dimly lit living room, Richard retrieved a small wooden box from his briefcase. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of items he had carried with him for years. Mementos of Olivia. There were photographs, a lock of her hair from her first haircut, and at the center, a crescent moon pendant nearly identical to the one Emily wore. Richard held the pendant in his hand, the cool silver pressing against his palm, as memories washed over him. He could still remember the day he gave it to Olivia. She had been 7 years old, sitting on his lap by the fireplace at their Texas ranch. "Daddy, what's this?" she had asked, her small fingers tracing the crescent shape. "It's a moon, sweetheart," he had explained, fastening the chain around her neck. "So no matter where you go, you'll always have a piece of the night sky with you." She had giggled, the sound bright and full of joy. "I'll never take it off, Daddy, I promise." But she had taken it off. At least he assumed she had. When Olivia disappeared, the pendant disappeared with her. He had searched for it desperately, hoping it would lead to answers, but it had never turned up. Until now. Richard closed his eyes, gripping the pendant tightly. What were the chances that Emily would possess something so personal, so specific? The resemblance was uncanny, and the timing aligned too perfectly to ignore. A knock at the door broke through his thoughts. Richard quickly placed the pendant back in the box and closed it before calling out, "Come in." The door creaked open, and Tom stepped in, his hat in hand. "Sorry to bother you, Mr. Thompson, but I thought you might want to know. Emily's still out in the fields. She likes to finish up after the others leave." Richard's brow furrowed. "She's working alone." Tom nodded. "That's just how she is. Says she likes the quiet. If you ask me, she works harder than most of the full-time staff." Richard hesitated for a moment before standing. "Thanks for letting me know, Tom. I think I'll go check on her." The sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving the fields bathed in the soft glow of twilight. Richard walked toward the orchard, the faint sound of crickets and rustling leaves filling the cool evening air. He spotted Emily near the edge of the property, stacking crates of apples onto a wooden cart. "Emily," he called, his voice breaking the stillness. She turned, surprised to see him. "Mr. Thompson, didn't expect to see you out here." Richard approached, noting the slight sheen of sweat on her brow and the streaks of dirt on her hands. "I could say the same about you. You should have clocked out hours ago." Emily shrugged, wiping her hands on her jeans. "I don't mind. It's peaceful out here. Helps me think." Richard glanced at the cart, then back at her. "You don't strike me as someone who needs much help thinking. You're sharp, observant." She laughed softly. "Thanks, I guess." His gaze drifted to the pendant around her neck. "That necklace of yours. It must mean a lot to you." Emily's expression softened as she touched the pendant. "Yeah, it's the only thing I have from before. It's silly, but sometimes I like to think it's a sign that I was loved, even if I don't remember by who." Her words struck Richard like a blow to the chest. He fought to keep his emotions in check, nodding thoughtfully. "It's not silly at all. Everyone deserves to feel that way." For a moment they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between them. Richard knew he couldn't push her for answers yet, not until James had more information. But one thing was certain: this pendant, this young woman, was the closest he had come to finding Olivia in 15 years. As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Richard turned to leave. "Take the rest of the night off, Emily. You've earned it." She smiled, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson." Walking back toward the farmhouse, Richard glanced up at the crescent moon hanging in the sky. He felt it then, a pull, like gravity, drawing him closer to the truth. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the farmhouse windows, casting warm streaks across the wooden floor. Richard sat at the kitchen table nursing a cup of coffee while scrolling through his phone. An email from James Calloway sat unread in his inbox. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it, his pulse quickening. The message was brief but direct. "Richard, I've started digging into Emily's past. She was dropped off at St. Mary's Orphanage in Abilene, Texas, 15 years ago. No documents, no birth certificate, just a note saying her name was Emily. There's more, but I'll need time to confirm the details. I'll keep you updated." Richard's grip tightened on the phone as he read the words. Abilene, less than 50 miles from the ranch where Olivia had disappeared. The timeline matched too perfectly to be coincidence. 15 years, he muttered, the words heavy with a mix of hope and unease. His mind swirled with possibilities. Could Emily's mysterious arrival at the orphanage be connected to Olivia's disappearance? And if so, what did it mean? The sound of a knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He set his phone down and called out, "Come in." Tom entered, his usual friendly demeanor accompanied by a hint of concern. "Morning, Mr. Thompson. I figured I'd let you know Emily's already out in the orchard. I don't know where she gets the energy." Richard offered a faint smile. "She seems to have a strong work ethic," Tom chuckled. "That's putting it lightly anyway. Just thought you'd want to know. Oh, and one more thing. There's been some chatter among the workers. They're curious why the boss is so interested in one of them." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Chatter. Well, you know how people talk, it's harmless, but..." Tom hesitated, clearly unsure how to phrase his next words. "You've been asking a lot about Emily, sir. Folks are starting to notice." Richard's expression remained neutral, but inwardly he felt a twinge of frustration. He couldn't afford rumors, at least not until he had answers. "Thanks for the heads up, Tom. I'll keep that in mind." As Tom left, Richard stood and grabbed his jacket. He needed to see Emily again, to observe her, to find anything that could confirm or deny the gnawing suspicion in his gut. Out in the orchard, the morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of apples and earth. Workers moved among the rows, their chatter blending with the hum of activity. Richard spotted Emily near the far end of the field, loading crates onto a small tractor. She worked efficiently, her movements precise and practiced. "Emily," he called, making his way toward her. She looked up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Mr. Thompson, you're making a habit of these surprise visits." Richard smiled faintly. "I like to see things firsthand, and besides, I thought I'd check in. You're always the first one out here and the last to leave." Emily shrugged, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "It's just how I am. Hard work keeps me grounded." Richard nodded, his gaze briefly flickering to the pendant around her neck. He couldn't resist asking, "Have you ever thought about looking into your past, finding out more about where you came from?" Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing slightly. "I've thought about it, sure, but I wouldn't even know where to start. The orphanage didn't keep much in the way of records, and I was so young when I got there." "What about the woman who dropped you off?" Richard pressed gently. "Do you remember anything about her?" Emily shook her head. "Not really. I was told she was in a hurry, didn't give much information, just handed me over and left." Richard's chest tightened. Every detail she shared seemed to draw the noose tighter around the possibility that Emily was connected to Olivia's disappearance. But there was still so much he didn't know, and he couldn't afford to let emotion cloud his judgment. "Well," he said, keeping his tone light, "if you ever decide to look into it, I might be able to help. I have a few connections." Emily tilted her head, studying him curiously. "Why are you so interested, Mr. Thompson?" Richard hesitated. For a brief moment, he considered telling her the truth, but he quickly dismissed the idea. It was too soon. Instead, he offered a carefully measured response. "I've always believed that knowing where we come from helps us understand who we are, that's all." She seemed to accept the answer, nodding slowly. "I'll think about it." Richard smiled, though his mind was already racing ahead. He would need James to dig deeper, to find concrete proof of Emily's connection to Olivia, or lack thereof. Until then, he would tread carefully, keeping his suspicions to himself. As the morning wore on, Richard returned to the farmhouse, leaving Emily to her work. He sat at the kitchen table, pulling out a notebook and jotting down every detail he could remember from their conversations. The orphanage, the crescent moon pendant, the woman who dropped her off. Each piece felt like a fragment of a larger puzzle. Hours later, his phone buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a message from James. "Richard, I've found something. The orphanage records list the woman who dropped off Emily as Jane Doe, but the description matches someone who worked near your ranch at the time Olivia disappeared. I'll send more details soon." Richard stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. This wasn't just coincidence anymore. The threads were weaving together, and for the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope. But hope, he knew, was a dangerous thing. Richard sat in the quiet of the farmhouse kitchen, James's message still glowing on his phone screen. His heart raced, the lines of text replaying in his mind. The description matches someone who worked near your ranch at the time Olivia disappeared. It was the closest thing to a lead he had in 15 years, and the weight of it pressed down on him like a heavy stone. He immediately dialed James, his hand trembling slightly as he brought the phone to his ear. It rang twice before the investigator's gruff voice answered. "Richard, I figured you'd call." "What else do you have?" Richard demanded, his tone sharp with urgency. "You said there's more. Don't hold back." James sighed on the other end. "It's not much yet, but it's enough to raise eyebrows. The woman who dropped off Emily at the orphanage fits the description of a maid who worked for a nearby property during the same summer. Olivia vanished. She left town shortly after the incident. No forwarding address, no trace. I'm still working on finding her." "Her name?" Richard pressed, gripping the edge of the table. "Nothing concrete," James admitted, "but some of the old employees at the ranch might remember. You'll need to follow up in person. There's only so much I can do remotely." Richard leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning with possibilities. The connections were undeniable, but questions lingered like shadows in the corners of his thoughts. Who was this woman? And why would she abandon a child with no explanation? Could she be the key to unraveling the mystery of Olivia's disappearance? "Keep digging," Richard said firmly. "I'll head to the ranch myself." James hesitated. "You sure about that? It might stir up memories you don't want to deal with." "I don't have a choice," Richard replied. "If this leads to Olivia, or even answers about Emily, I have to follow it." After ending the call, Richard packed a small bag and left a note for Tom explaining his sudden trip. The drive to the old ranch was long and solitary, the open road giving him too much time to think. Memories of summers spent there with Olivia flooded his mind, her laughter echoing through the halls, the way she'd chase fireflies at dusk, the joy on her face when they'd ride horses together. When he finally arrived, the sight of the ranch hit him like a punch to the gut. The once vibrant property was now eerily quiet, the house weathered and overgrown with vines. The gates creaked as he pushed them open, and the crunch of gravel under his boots was the only sound as he approached the front door. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of wood rot. The furniture had been covered with sheets, and sunlight filtered through cracks in the shutters. It was as if time had stood still since the day he left. Unable to bear the memories, Richard moved through the house methodically, searching for anything that might jog his memory or provide a clue. In Olivia's old room, he found her favorite stuffed animal, a worn bunny with one floppy ear. Sitting on the bed, his chest tightened as he picked it up, the ache of loss nearly overwhelming. But he didn't have time to dwell on the past. He needed answers. The next morning, Richard drove into town to meet with some of the ranch's former staff. Most had moved on years ago, but he managed to track down a few who still lived nearby. They were hesitant at first, unsure why he was dredging up old memories. But eventually, one of the older housekeepers, Mrs. Grayson, spoke up. "I remember the woman you're talking about," she said, her wrinkled hands clutching a cup of tea. Her name was Margie. Quiet, kept to herself. She didn't last long, left right after that awful business with your daughter. Richard's heart skipped a beat. "Do you know where she went?" Mrs. Grayson shook her head. "No one does, but..." She paused, frowning as if recalling something. "I do remember she mentioned having family in Abilene. That's all I know, I'm afraid." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Richard thanked her and left, his mind racing. Margie had to be the woman who dropped off Emily. If she had family in Abilene, it was possible someone there could provide more information. Before returning to his car, Richard called James again. "I need you to find everything you can about a woman named Margie, who worked at my ranch 15 years ago. She might have ties to Abilene." "Got it," James replied. "I'll dig into it and let you know as soon as I find anything." As he ended the call, Richard leaned against the car, staring out at the horizon. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but each answer seemed to lead to more questions. If Margie was involved in Olivia's disappearance, what was her motive? And why would she abandon a child at an orphanage with nothing but a crescent moon pendant, driving back to the farmhouse in California that evening? Richard felt the weight of the day pressing down on him. He was closer to the truth than he'd been in years, but the journey was far from over, and while Emily remained oblivious to his investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that her life, and his, were about to change forever. As he pulled into the driveway, the sight of Emily standing by the barn caught his attention. She was brushing dirt off her jeans, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. The crescent moon pendant glinted in the fading sunlight, a quiet reminder of the mystery that bound them together. For a brief moment, Richard considered approaching her, telling her everything, but the timing wasn't right. Not yet. Instead, he stepped out of the car and gave her a small nod. "Busy day?" she asked, her tone light but curious. "You could say that," Richard replied, forcing a smile. "Let's just say I'm getting closer to some answers." The next morning, Richard awoke with a sense of urgency gnawing at him. The pieces of the puzzle were aligning, and the truth felt close enough to touch. But the deeper he delved, the more dangerous the waters seemed. The name Margie echoed in his mind, tied to the possibilities he hadn't dared to fully consider. If she had been involved in Olivia's disappearance, how much of Emily's life was a result of lies? By mid-morning, James had called with a new development. "I've tracked down a Margie Sullivan who used to work at your ranch," James said. "She moved to Abilene shortly after Olivia disappeared. It took some digging, but I found out she passed away 5 years ago. However, she has a surviving son, Robert Sullivan." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. The name sent a chill down his spine. "Robert Sullivan," he repeated, his voice cold. "Yes," James confirmed. "He's the same Robert Sullivan you had business dealings with years ago, the same man you parted ways with after that nasty lawsuit." Richard's mind raced. Robert had always been a thorn in his side, a ruthless businessman with little regard for ethics. Their partnership had ended in bitter acrimony, and Richard hadn't spoken to him in years. But the revelation that Robert was connected to Margie, and possibly to Emily, cast their rivalry in an entirely new light. "Send me everything you have on him," Richard said firmly. "I'll handle the rest." After ending the call, Richard paced the farmhouse kitchen, his thoughts swirling. Robert's connection to Margie couldn't be a coincidence. If Robert had anything to do with Olivia's disappearance, or Emily's placement in an orphanage. Then Richard needed answers, and he needed them now. His decision was made. That afternoon, he would confront Robert directly. The drive to Robert Sullivan's estate was a stark contrast to the peaceful farmland Richard had grown accustomed to. The sprawling mansion loomed behind wrought iron gates, a symbol of excess and arrogance. Richard parked his car and pressed the intercom button. His jaw clenched as he waited for a response. Moments later, the gates creaked open, and Richard drove up the winding driveway. A butler greeted him at the door, his expression neutral. "Mr. Sullivan will see you in his study." Richard stepped inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The house was opulent to the point of excess, every inch screaming wealth and power. It reminded him of the kind of man Robert had always been. Flashy, unrestrained, and unapologetically greedy. The study was no different, lined with mahogany bookshelves and adorned with oil paintings. Robert stood by the window, a glass of whiskey in hand. His gray hair was slicked back, and his tailored suit was impeccable, but the smirk on his face was as infuriating as ever. "Richard Thompson," Robert said, turning to face him. "To what do I owe the pleasure? It's been years." "This isn't a social call," Richard replied, his tone sharp. "I'm here for answers." Robert raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Answers? About what?" Richard stepped closer, his gaze unyielding. "Margie Sullivan. She worked at my ranch the summer Olivia disappeared. And now I find out she's your mother. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending it's a coincidence." The smirk faltered for a moment, before Robert took a slow sip of his whiskey. "Margie was my mother, yes, but whatever you're implying, you're barking up the wrong tree." "Am I?" Richard's voice was low, almost dangerous. 15 years ago, my daughter vanished. 15 years ago, your mother left town with no explanation. And now I find a young woman with a crescent moon pendant identical to Olivia's, abandoned at an orphanage near Abilene. Robert's expression hardened. "Emily," he said, the name slipping from his lips before he could stop it. The slip wasn't lost on Richard. He took another step forward, his anger barely restrained. "You know her? You've known all along, haven't you?" Robert set his glass down with a deliberate clink, his demeanor shifting from feigned innocence to cold defiance. "I didn't take your daughter, Richard, but yes, I know Emily. She's my daughter, not yours." The words hit Richard like a blow. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, his mind struggling to process the revelation. "Your daughter," he repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. Robert met his gaze without flinching. "Margie found her wandering near your ranch. She assumed the worst, that Olivia was abandoned or unwanted. She brought Emily to the orphanage because she thought it was the safest option. Years later, I tracked her down and brought her back into my life. She's been with me ever since." Richard's hands curled into fists at his sides. "And you never thought to tell me. You never thought I had a right to know. Why would I?" Robert shot back, his tone icy. "You think I owed you anything after the way you treated me? Besides, Emily isn't your daughter. She's mine, and she doesn't need you dragging her into your endless obsession." The accusation cut deep, but Richard refused to back down. "If Emily isn't Olivia, then where is she? What happened to my daughter?" Robert's expression darkened, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. "I don't know," he said finally, his voice quieter. "And that's the truth. But I suggest you tread carefully, Richard. Digging into the past can unearth things better left buried." Richard stared at him, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "If you're lying to me, I'll find out. And when I do, you'll regret every second of it." Without waiting for a response, Richard turned on his heel and strode out of the study, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the grand halls. As he drove away from the estate, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions: anger, frustration, and a faint glimmer of hope. Emily wasn't Olivia, but the connection was undeniable. The truth was there, buried beneath layers of lies and secrets, and Richard was more determined than ever to uncover it. The road back to the farm stretched endlessly before Richard, his thoughts racing as the engine hummed steadily beneath him. The confrontation with Robert Sullivan had left him with more questions than answers. Emily wasn't Olivia, but she wasn't entirely a stranger either. The revelation that Margie, Robert's mother, had found Emily near the ranch on that fateful summer couldn't be ignored. It was as though the universe was weaving their lives together with threads Richard couldn't yet see when he arrived back at the farm. The evening sun was low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and lavender. Workers were finishing up for the day, their voices carrying softly over the fields. Richard's eyes immediately sought out Emily. He found her near the barn, securing crates of apples onto a flatbed truck. Her movements were efficient, yet there was a noticeable weariness to her posture. Steeling himself, Richard approached. "You don't seem to take many breaks," he said, his tone lighter than he felt. Emily looked up, surprised but not displeased to see him. She brushed her hands on her jeans and smiled faintly. "Guess I'm not great at sitting still." He nodded, appreciating her honesty. A strong work ethic is a rare quality these days. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Emily tilted her head, curious. "Who's that?" Richard hesitated, caught off guard by the simplicity of her question. "My daughter," he admitted, his voice softening. "She was about your age when she—" He trailed off. Unable to finish the sentence, Emily's expression shifted, a mixture of sympathy and discomfort crossing her features. "I didn't know you had a daughter," she said carefully. "I don't talk about her much," Richard replied, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "She disappeared when she was a child. It's been a long time. But some wounds don't heal." Emily didn't respond immediately, but her eyes lingered on him, thoughtful and kind. "I can't imagine what that must have been like. I'm sorry." "Thank you," Richard said, his voice tinged with gratitude. "It's complicated, but enough about me. What about you? Do you ever think about your own past?" Emily shrugged, her fingers absent-mindedly brushing against the crescent moon pendant. "Sometimes, but I don't really have much to go on. The orphanage wasn't exactly big on details. Most of what I know is just bits and pieces from the staff." "What about Margie?" Richard asked, testing the waters. "The woman who dropped you off. Did they ever tell you anything about her?" Emily frowned slightly, as though trying to recall distant memories. "Not much. They said she seemed scared, like she was running from something. I remember the caretaker telling me she promised to come back, but she never did." Richard's chest tightened at her words. He could picture it all too clearly. Margie driven by fear or guilt, abandoning a child she didn't know how to protect. But what had driven her to such desperation? And why hadn't Robert told Emily the truth about her origins? "Do you ever think about finding her?" he asked, careful to keep his tone neutral. "Sometimes," Emily admitted, her voice quieter now. "But I don't know where I'd even start. And honestly, I'm not sure it would change anything. My life is here now." Richard studied her, impressed by her resilience. Despite everything she had been through, Emily seemed grounded in a way he could barely fathom. It only made his determination to protect her, and to uncover the truth, stronger. "Well," he said after a moment, "if you ever do decide to look into it, let me know. I might be able to help." Emily gave him a curious look, but didn't press further. "Thanks. I'll think about it." Their conversation was interrupted by Tom, who called out from across the field. "Emily, we need those crates loaded up before the truck leaves." She nodded, glancing back at Richard with a small smile. "Duty calls. Thanks for checking in, Mr. Thompson." "Any time," Richard replied, watching as she walked away. The pendant around her neck gleamed in the fading light, a silent reminder of the secrets they both carried. That evening, Richard sat on the porch of the farmhouse, nursing a glass of bourbon as the stars began to appear. His phone buzzed, and he picked it up to see another message from James. "I've confirmed the connection between Margie and Emily. Margie worked for Robert after leaving your ranch, but it's unclear if he knew about her involvement with the orphanage. I'm still digging into Emily's records. There's something odd about the timeline. We'll update soon." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. Odd about the timeline. What could that mean? The questions swirled in his mind, but the answers felt just out of reach. For now, all he could do was wait, and hope that whatever James uncovered would bring him closer to the truth. The next morning, Richard found himself walking the orchard again. Drawn to the peace it offered, he spotted Emily near the same row of trees as before, carefully inspecting the apples for blemishes. As he approached, she looked up and smiled. "Back already?" she teased. Richard chuckled. "I could ask you the same thing. Do you ever take a day off?" Not if I can help it, she replied, brushing her hands on her jeans. They fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, talking about everything and nothing. Richard found himself genuinely enjoying her company, her warmth and humor, a refreshing contrast to the weight of his usual life. But beneath the surface, his thoughts remained focused. Emily might not be Olivia, but she was tied to her disappearance in ways neither of them fully understood, and as much as Richard wanted to shield her from the pain of the past, he knew he couldn't stop the truth from coming to light as the day wore on. Richard left the orchard with a newfound resolve. Emily deserved to know who she truly was, and so did he. The early morning air carried the soft rustle of leaves as Richard paced the farmhouse kitchen, phone pressed tightly to his ear. James's voice came through the line, calm but with an undertone of urgency. "Richard, I've uncovered something important," James began. "Emily's orphanage records were altered. The original intake date doesn't align with the official story. She was dropped off later than we thought, nearly a month after Olivia's disappearance." Richard's brow furrowed as he processed the information. "A month? That doesn't make any sense. Why would Margie wait that long?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," James replied. "But there's more. Margie listed Emily's age as 5 years old, not 7, which was Olivia's age at the time. If Margie knew the truth, she went to great lengths to hide it." Richard gripped the counter, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "Do you think Robert knew?" "It's possible," James said cautiously. "But without concrete proof, it's hard to say. What's clear is that Margie didn't just stumble upon Emily. She was hiding something." Richard ended the call, his mind swirling with possibilities. Margie's actions pointed to a deliberate attempt to obscure Emily's identity. But why? And what role, if any, had Robert played in all of this? Determined to confront the truth, Richard stepped outside, the morning sun warming his face. Emily was already in the orchard, as usual, her silhouette framed by the golden light. She was sorting apples into crates, her movements steady and practiced. The sight of her stirred a mix of emotions in Richard, admiration for her resilience, and an aching desire to protect her from the secrets threatening to surface. "Emily," he called, walking toward her. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Morning, Mr. Thompson. You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, stopping a few feet away. "Do you have a minute to talk?" Emily straightened, her expression curious but cautious. "Sure. What's on your mind?" Richard hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've been looking into your past. The orphanage. Margie, I hope you don't mind." Emily's brow furrowed. "Why would you do that?" "I had my reasons," he said carefully. "And I've found some things you deserve to know." Her posture stiffened, but she didn't interrupt. "Margie didn't just drop you off at the orphanage," Richard began. "She waited almost a month after finding you. And the records she left behind, they don't add up. Your age, the timing, it's all wrong." Emily's eyes narrowed, confusion and suspicion flickering across her face. "What are you trying to say, Mr. Thompson?" "I think Margie knew more about your past than she let on," Richard said. "And I think Robert, your father, might have known too." Emily stepped back, shaking her head. "No, that doesn't make sense, my dad. He never mentioned anything like that." Richard's voice softened. "I'm not trying to hurt you, Emily. I'm trying to help you find the truth." She crossed her arms, her gaze wary. "Why do you care so much? You've only known me for a few weeks." "Because I lost someone," Richard said, his voice tight with emotion. "My daughter, Olivia. She disappeared 15 years ago, and every lead I've followed has led me nowhere. Until now." Emily's eyes widened, the weight of his words sinking in. "You think I'm your daughter?" Richard hesitated. "At first I thought it was possible, but now I know you're not. Still, there's a connection between us. Between you and Olivia. I can feel it." Emily stared at him, her expression unreadable. "This is insane. You're saying my whole life is a lie?" "I'm saying we need answers," Richard replied, "together." The rest of the day passed in tense silence. Emily avoided Richard, her thoughts too chaotic to face him again. The idea that her father, the man who had raised her, might have hidden the truth about her origins was unbearable. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily found herself walking through the orchard, seeking the solace of the quiet rows of trees. She clutched the crescent moon pendant around her neck, its cool surface grounding her in the midst of her turmoil. "Margie," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why didn't you come back for me? What were you so afraid of?" The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Richard stood a few feet away, his expression somber. "I didn't mean to upset you," he said gently. Emily sighed, her shoulders slumping. "It's not your fault. I don't know what to believe anymore." Richard took a step closer, his voice steady but compassionate. "The truth is messy, Emily, but running from it won't make it go away." She met his gaze. Her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if the truth isn't what I want to hear?" "Then you face it," Richard said, "because it's better to know than to live in the dark." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the night air cool against their skin. Finally, Emily nodded. "Okay, I'll help you, but only if you promise me one thing." "Anything," Richard said without hesitation. "If we find out my dad, Robert, had something to do with this, you won't drag him through the mud. He's not perfect, but he's still my family." Richard's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "I promise." Emily looked at him for a moment longer, then extended her hand. "All right, Mr. Thompson, let's find the truth." He took her hand, a sense of determination settling over him. "We will." As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of a revelation that would change everything. But for the first time in years, he wasn't facing the journey alone. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sunlight painting golden streaks across the farm. Richard and Emily sat across from each other at the farmhouse kitchen table, their expressions tense but resolute. Between them lay a small stack of papers Richard had received early that morning, documents that James had unearthed during the night. "These are the records James sent me," Richard began, sliding the papers toward Emily. "They confirm what I suspected. Margie didn't just find you by chance. She was connected to my ranch at the time Olivia disappeared." Emily's hand trembled slightly as she picked up the papers. The words blurred together for a moment before she focused on a particular detail. St. Mary's Orphanage, Abilene, Texas. Intake date, July 18th, 15 years ago. The timing was impossible to ignore. "So, Margie worked for your family and then dropped me off at this orphanage," Emily said slowly, her voice laced with uncertainty. "But why would she do that? And why wouldn't my dad tell me?" Richard hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "I don't know Margie's exact motives. Maybe she was trying to protect you, or herself. As for Robert, I suspect he's known more about your past than he's let on." Emily set the papers down, her face pale. "What do we do now?" "We find Olivia," Richard said firmly. "If Margie took you, then there's a chance she knew something about my daughter. She might have left more behind than we realize." Emily stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt, but all she found was determination. She nodded. "All right, where do we start?" The first step was to revisit the orphanage in Abilene. Although decades had passed since Emily had been left there, Richard hoped that someone, anyone, might remember Margie or have records that could point them in the right direction. The drive was long, stretching across hours of open highways and dusty roads. Emily remained mostly silent, her thoughts too chaotic to share. Richard occasionally glanced at her, his heart heavy with a mix of guilt and hope. He had dragged her into this whirlwind of uncertainty, but he was determined to see it through. When they finally arrived, the orphanage stood like a relic from another time, its weathered brick facade and creaking sign bearing the marks of age. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood and lemon polish. A kind-looking woman in her 60s greeted them at the front desk. "Welcome to St. Mary's," she said with a smile. "How can I help you?" Richard stepped forward. "My name is Richard Thompson. This is Emily. She was brought here as a child. About 15 years ago, we're hoping you might have some records from that time." The woman's smile faltered slightly, a shadow of concern crossing her face. "Oh my, that was so long ago. But we do keep detailed records. Let me check the archives." She disappeared into a back room, leaving Richard and Emily alone in the quiet lobby. Emily fidgeted with her pendant, her anxiety evident. "What if this doesn't lead anywhere?" she whispered. "What if all of this is for nothing?" "It won't be," Richard said firmly. "We'll find something, I promise." Minutes later, The woman returned with a thick file in her hands. She set it down on the desk and began flipping through the pages. "Here we are," she said, pointing to a faded entry. "Emily was brought to us by a woman named Margie Sullivan. She didn't leave much information, but..." The woman trailed off, her brow furrowing as she examined the file more closely. "But what?" Richard prompted. "There's a note attached to the intake form," the woman said. Carefully unfolding a piece of yellowed paper, she read it aloud. "Keep her safe. She has no one else. Please don't ask questions. It's unsigned." Emily's breath caught. "That's all." The woman nodded, her expression apologetic. "I'm afraid so. Margie didn't explain why she was leaving you or where she had come from." Richard leaned forward, his voice steady. "Do you remember anything about Margie? Anything at all?" The woman hesitated, tapping a finger against her chin. "I do recall she seemed nervous, almost scared, and she mentioned something about another child, a little girl who had been taken from her." Emily's eyes widened. "Another child," the woman nodded. "I assumed she was talking about her own child, but now, well, it's hard to say." Richard's pulse quickened. Another child. Could it be Olivia? Had Margie been trying to hint at something all along? "Thank you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been incredibly helpful." The woman offered a small smile. "I hope you find what you're looking for." Back in the car, Emily stared out the window, her mind reeling. "Another child," she murmured. "Do you think she was talking about Olivia?" "It's possible," Richard said. "If Margie knew something about Olivia's disappearance, she might have been trying to leave a clue." Emily shook her head, frustration bubbling to the surface. None of this makes sense. If she knew something, why didn't she just tell someone? Why go through all this secrecy? "Fear," Richard said quietly. "Margie was afraid of something, or someone, and until we know what that was, we won't have the full picture." Emily fell silent, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat. The weight of the mystery pressed heavily on her, but beneath the frustration was a spark of hope. For the first time, she felt like she was starting to understand the pieces of her past, even if they were far from complete as they drove back toward the farm. Richard glanced at her, his expression softening. "We'll figure this out, Emily, together." She looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also determination. "I hope you're right." That night, as Richard reviewed the documents again, his phone buzzed with a message from James. "Found something big. Olivia might still be alive. Call me immediately." The words sent a jolt through Richard's chest. For the first time in years, hope felt tangible, terrifying but undeniable. Richard's fingers hovered over the phone, James's message still glowing on the screen. The words, "Olivia might still be alive," echoed in his mind, stirring a mix of emotions he hadn't felt in years: hope, fear, and a gnawing dread that this lead might crumble like so many others before. Taking a deep breath, he dialed James's number. The line rang twice before the investigator answered, his voice brisk and serious. "Richard, I didn't want to text everything. This is too big." "Tell me," Richard demanded, his voice tight with urgency. "What did you find?" James hesitated for a moment. "I tracked down someone who used to work closely with Margie after she left the ranch. An old neighbor of hers in Abilene. She remembers Margie talking about a little girl she was trying to protect. The neighbor claims Margie believed the child wasn't safe and was being watched." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Watched by who?" "That's where it gets interesting," James continued. "She didn't name names, but Margie allegedly feared someone connected to your family, Richard. I think she was talking about Robert." The name hit like a thunderclap. "Robert, are you saying he—" "I don't have proof yet," James interrupted, his tone careful. "But Margie's actions suggest she was trying to keep the child, Olivia, away from him. If Margie thought Robert was dangerous or involved in Olivia's disappearance, it explains why she went to such lengths to cover her tracks." Richard's mind raced. "So you're saying Olivia is alive and Robert might know where she is?" "Not just alive," James said. "I believe Olivia grew up alongside Emily. Margie hid both girls." The line went silent as Richard processed the revelation. Olivia, his Olivia, could have been right in front of him all along, disguised by a life of secrets and lies. "Where do I find her?" Richard finally asked, his voice trembling. Where's Olivia now? That's the complicated part, James replied. After Margie's death, Robert took custody of Emily, but there's no record of Olivia under her name. Either she's living under an alias, or Robert hid her somewhere else entirely. Richard felt a surge of anger and determination. Then I'll confront him again. He's been lying to everyone, especially Emily. I'd be careful, James warned. If Robert's been hiding Olivia all these years, he won't give her up easily. Let me worry about that, Richard said before ending the call. He leaned back in his chair, his thoughts spiraling. If James was right, then everything, the pendant, the altered records, the years of heartache, had been leading to this moment. The next morning, Richard found Emily in the orchard, her hands deftly plucking apples from the branches. She glanced up when he approached, sensing his serious expression. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said cautiously. "You look like you've got something on your mind." "I do," he admitted. "Emily, I need to talk to you about your father." She froze, the apple in her hand forgotten. "What about him?" Richard hesitated, his gaze steady. "I think Robert knows more about your past, and mine, than he's ever admitted. And I believe it's time we confronted him together." Emily's brow furrowed, uncertainty clouding her features. "Confront him. About what?" "About the truth," Richard said, his voice firm. "Emily, there's a chance that my daughter Olivia didn't disappear. She might have been hidden, by Margie and later by Robert. If that's true, then you and Olivia might have grown up as sisters without even knowing it." The color drained from Emily's face. "Sisters, are you saying—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Richard nodded. "It's a possibility, but we won't know until we get answers. And the only person who can give us those answers is Robert." Emily stepped back, shaking her head. No, this doesn't make sense, my dad. He wouldn't do something like that. He's strict, sure, but he's not a bad person." "Emily," Richard said gently, "I know this is hard to hear, but if there's even a chance that Olivia is alive, I have to take it, and you deserve to know the truth about your own past." She looked away, her hands gripping the pendant around her neck. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Finally, she met his gaze, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll go with you. But if you're wrong about this, I understand," Richard said, his voice steady. "If I'm wrong, I'll leave you and your father alone. But if I'm right—" He didn't finish the sentence. The weight of what they might uncover hung heavily in the air. That afternoon, Richard and Emily drove to Robert's estate. The tension between them was palpable, neither speaking as the car wound its way through the sprawling countryside. When they arrived, the butler from Richard's previous visit opened the door, his expression neutral. "Mr. Sullivan is in his study," he said simply, stepping aside to let them in. Robert looked up from his desk as they entered, his eyes narrowing when he saw Emily with Richard. "Well, this is a surprise," he said, his tone clipped. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "We need to talk," Richard said, his voice firm. Robert's gaze flicked to Emily, then back to Richard. "Does this have something to do with your obsession with the past? Because if it does—" "This is about Olivia," Richard interrupted, "and about the lies you've been telling Emily her entire life." Robert's expression darkened, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you think you found, but you're wrong." "Am I?" Richard shot back. "Margie didn't just leave Emily at the orphanage, she hid her. And Olivia, you've known all along, haven't you?" Emily turned to Robert, her voice trembling. "Dad, is this true? Did you know—" Robert stood, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Emily, listen to me. I've always protected you. Everything I've done was to keep you safe." "Safe from what?" Emily demanded. "From the truth." Robert's silence was deafening. Emily's face crumpled as the realization hit her. "You've been lying to me," she whispered. "My whole life." "Emily," Robert started, but she cut him off. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I want the truth. Where is Olivia?" Robert's expression wavered, guilt flashing across his face. For the first time, Richard saw fear in the man's eyes. And in that moment, Richard knew the truth was closer than ever. The air in Robert's study felt heavy, the tension suffocating as Richard and Emily stared him down. Robert's usually confident demeanor cracked, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the glass of whiskey on his desk. Emily's voice broke through the silence, sharp and trembling. "Dad," she said, her tone more a plea than a command. "Where is Olivia? What do you know?" Robert's eyes darted between Emily and Richard, his jaw tightening as though weighing the consequences of his next words. Finally, he sighed and set the glass down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his secrets. "You don't understand," Robert began, his voice low. "I never wanted this to happen. None of it." "Wanted what to happen?" Richard demanded, his anger barely restrained. "You've been hiding the truth for years, Robert. Start talking." Robert hesitated, his gaze lingering on Emily. "You have to believe me, Emily. Everything I've done was to protect you." "Protect me from what?" she snapped, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "From my own life, from the truth about who I am." Robert's face crumpled, and for the first time, Richard saw something resembling remorse. "I didn't know who you were at first," he admitted. "When Margie brought you to me, she said you were abandoned, that your family didn't want you. I believed her." Richard felt his chest tighten. The lies were unraveling, but they weren't enough, not yet. "And Olivia," he pressed. "Where is my daughter?" Robert looked at him, a flicker of fear crossing his face. "Margie found her. She was with Emily when Margie left the ranch, but Margie couldn't handle the responsibility of raising 2 children. She gave Olivia to someone else." The room fell silent, the weight of Robert's words crashing down like a tidal wave. Richard's mind raced, the implications hitting him all at once. Olivia hadn't been lost. She'd been hidden. "Who?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. "Who did she give her to?" "I don't know," Robert said, his voice breaking. "I swear I don't. Margie never told me. By the time I found Emily at the orphanage, Olivia was already gone." Emily shook her head, disbelief etched across her face. "You lied to me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've been lying my whole life." "I was trying to protect you," Robert insisted, his tone desperate. "Margie was terrified. She said Olivia's disappearance wasn't an accident, that someone was after her. I didn't know what else to do." Richard's anger boiled over. "You didn't know what to do, so you did nothing. You let my daughter disappear into thin air while you raised Emily like she was your own." "I raised her because I loved her," Robert shouted back. "I couldn't find Olivia, but I could give Emily a home. I did what I thought was right." Emily stepped back, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "And you never told me. You let me believe I was your daughter." "You are my daughter," Robert said, his voice softening. "Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters." Emily looked away, tears streaming down her face. "That's not your decision to make." The drive back to the farm was silent. Emily stared out the window, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Richard kept his focus on the road, his mind churning with questions. If what Robert said was true, then Olivia was alive. But where? And who had taken her? When they reached the farmhouse, Emily immediately retreated to her room, shutting the door without a word. Richard gave her space, understanding she needed time to process everything, but he couldn't rest. Not now. Sitting at the kitchen table, he pulled out his phone and called James. The investigator answered on the first ring. "Tell me you have something," Richard said, skipping the formalities. "I've been working non-stop since our last call," James replied. "I dug deeper into Margie's life after she left your ranch. Turns out, she had a connection to a woman named Helen Carter. Helen was a social worker in Texas at the time and worked with at-risk children." "What does this have to do with Olivia?" Richard asked, his patience wearing thin. "Helen Carter is the person Margie handed Olivia over to," James said. "I found old correspondence between them. Margie trusted Helen to keep Olivia safe. But after Margie died, Helen disappeared. No forwarding address, no trace." Richard's grip tightened on the phone. "So you're saying Olivia is still out there, with Helen?" "It's possible," James admitted, "but finding Helen won't be easy. She went off the grid 15 years ago. There's no record of her since." Richard leaned back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him. "Then find her," he said firmly. "Do whatever it takes." "I'm on it," James promised before hanging up. Later that evening, Richard knocked softly on Emily's door. When she didn't respond, he pushed it open slightly, finding her sitting on the edge of the bed, her pendant clutched tightly in her hand. "Emily," he said gently, stepping inside. "I know this is overwhelming. I can't imagine how you're feeling right now." She looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed. "I don't know who I am anymore," she admitted. "Everything I thought I knew was a lie." Richard sat beside her, his voice steady. "You're strong, Emily. Stronger than anyone I've ever met. And no matter what happens, you're not alone in this. We'll find Olivia, and we'll figure out where you fit into all of this." She nodded slowly, her fingers loosening around the pendant. "Do you really think she's alive?" "I do," Richard said, his voice firm. "And I won't stop until I find her." Emily managed a small, shaky smile. "Then I guess we're in this together." Richard placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Together, as the night deepened, both of them knew the journey ahead would be anything but easy. But for the first time, the path forward felt clear, and neither of them would face it alone. The days following their confrontation with Robert passed in a blur of restless anticipation. Emily threw herself into work at the orchard, using the physical labor to distract from the turmoil in her mind. Richard, however, couldn't afford such luxuries. Every moment was dedicated to finding Helen Carter, and, by extension, Olivia. Late one afternoon, Richard received a call from James. He answered before the first ring had finished, his voice taut with urgency. "What did you find?" "Richard, I've got something," James said, his tone serious. "I tracked down a former colleague of Helen Carter, a retired social worker named Patricia West. She hasn't spoken to Helen in years, but she remembers something important." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "Go on." "Patricia claims Helen left Texas shortly after taking custody of a child matching Olivia's description. She moved to Oregon and started working under a different name, Helen Waters. Patricia didn't know where Helen went after that, but it's a start." Richard's heart pounded. "Oregon," he repeated, his mind racing. "That's farther than I expected. From what Patricia told me, Helen was terrified," James added. "She thought someone was after the child. That lines up with what Margie believed. Helen went to great lengths to stay off the radar." Richard ran a hand through his hair, his resolve hardening. "Then I'll go to Oregon, if Olivia's there. I'll find her. I'll send you everything I have," James said. "Good luck, Richard." That evening, Richard shared the news with Emily as they sat on the porch, the stars twinkling faintly overhead. She listened intently, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "So, you're leaving?" she said after he finished explaining. Richard nodded. "If Helen Waters is the same Helen Carter, she might know where Olivia is. I have to follow this lead." Emily looked down, fiddling with the pendant around her neck. "And what happens after that? What if Olivia doesn't want to be found?" Richard's chest tightened. It was a fear he hadn't voiced, though it haunted him every night. "Then at least I'll know she's alive," he said softly. "But I have to try, Emily. I owe her that much." Emily hesitated before meeting his gaze. "I want to come with you." Richard blinked, surprised. "Emily, this trip could open up even more questions about your past. Are you sure you're ready for that?" She nodded firmly. "I've spent my whole life not knowing who I am. If there's even a chance I have a sister out there, I want to meet her, and I want to help you find her." Richard studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right, we'll do this together." The journey to Oregon was long, the miles stretching endlessly beneath the wheels of their rental car. Emily asked occasional questions about Olivia, what she was like as a child, her favorite things, the sound of her laughter. But for the most part, they drove in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they finally arrived in the small town where Helen had last been seen, the air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. The town itself was quaint, its streets lined with mom-and-pop stores and cozy coffee shops. Richard felt a strange sense of hope as they parked outside a modest library, one of the addresses James had provided. Inside, the librarian, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes, peered curiously at them over her glasses. "Can I help you?" she asked. Richard stepped forward. "We're looking for someone who might have worked here a long time ago. Helen Waters. Do you remember her?" The librarian's brow furrowed as she thought. "Helen Waters. That name does sound familiar. She worked here briefly." "Oh, must have been 12 or 13 years ago." Quiet woman, kept to herself. She had a young girl with her. Richard's pulse quickened. A young girl. Do you remember anything about her? The librarian's expression softened. Not much, I'm afraid, but they were close. Helen always called her Livy. She paused, then added, Helen left suddenly one day. No goodbyes. Just disappeared. Richard exchanged a glance with Emily, both of them caught by the significance of the nickname. Livy. It had been his pet name for Olivia when she was little. Do you know where she went? Richard asked, his voice trembling slightly. The librarian shook her head. I'm sorry, but no, she never said. Richard's heart sank, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was still a lead, proof that Helen had been here with Olivia. He thanked the librarian and turned back toward Emily. She was here, he said, his voice firm. We're close. They spent the rest of the day combing through the town, following every scrap of information they could find about Helen Waters. It was a painstaking process, but by evening, they had another lead. A small cabin on the outskirts of the nearby woods that Helen had rented for several years. As they drove toward the cabin, the tension in the car was palpable. Emily twisted her hands nervously in her lap, her thoughts written plainly on her face. You think she'll be there? She asked quietly. I don't know, Richard admitted. But if she's not, there might still be something left behind, something that tells us where she went. The cabin came into view, nestled among tall evergreens. It was small and weathered, its windows dark and uninviting. Richard parked the car, and they stepped out into the cool night air, their breaths visible in the faint moonlight. Stay close, Richard said, his voice low as they approached the cabin. The door was unlocked, creaking loudly as Richard pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. The furniture was sparse, and most of the surfaces were covered with a thin layer of grime. Emily's gaze landed on a small wooden box sitting on a shelf. She walked over and opened it, her breath catching as she pulled out a photograph. It was of two young girls, one with chestnut hair and the other with darker curls, standing side by side. Richard, she whispered, holding up the picture. Is this... He took the photo, his hands trembling. There was no mistaking it. The girl with chestnut hair was Olivia. We're close, he said, his voice shaking with emotion. So close. The discovery of the photograph left Richard and Emily reeling. The image of two young girls, one unmistakably Olivia, standing side by side was irrefutable proof that Helen had hidden Olivia, just as Margie had tried to protect Emily. Richard clutched the photograph tightly, the sight of Olivia's chestnut hair and familiar smile igniting both hope and sorrow. Emily stood beside him, her voice trembling. She looks just like you. Richard swallowed hard, his emotions raw. That's her. That's Olivia. The cabin's silence was deafening, broken only by the soft creak of floorboards as Emily moved to inspect the rest of the small space. On a nearby table, she found a notebook covered in dust. She carefully flipped it open, revealing pages filled with scribbled notes and dates. The handwriting was hurried and uneven, as though written in moments of panic. Richard, she called, her voice barely above a whisper. You need to see this. He joined her, peering over her shoulder at the pages. One entry stood out, dated nearly 15 years ago. They're looking for her. I have to leave. If they find out where she is, they'll take her away. Livy deserves a chance at a normal life. Richard's chest tightened. The words confirmed everything James had told him. Helen had been running, protecting Olivia from someone. And now, the question that haunted him more than ever. Who was chasing her? Emily flipped through more pages, her brow furrowed. There are addresses here, places she stayed. Texas, New Mexico, and Oregon. Richard's heart pounded. The trail's been there all along, we just need to follow it. Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with determination. Then let's go. We're not stopping now. Armed with the photograph and the notebook, they returned to their car. The first address in the notebook was only a few hours away. Another small town on the outskirts of a forested area. Richard drove in focused silence, his thoughts racing. Emily sat beside him, clutching the photograph tightly, as though it might slip away if she let go. They reached the next town as the sun was setting. It was even smaller than the last. Its main street lined with a few shops and a single gas station. The address led them to a modest house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood. The lights were off, and the overgrown lawn suggested the property had been vacant for some time. Richard and Emily stepped out of the car, their footsteps crunching on the gravel driveway. Richard knocked on the door, his heart hammering in his chest. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but the house remained silent. "She's not here," Emily said softly, disappointment lacing her voice. Richard exhaled slowly, his eyes scanning the property. "Let's look around. Maybe there's something inside." The door was locked, but a window around the back was slightly ajar. Richard climbed through carefully, landing in what appeared to be a small living room. The air inside was stale, and the faint scent of mildew lingered. Emily followed, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house was sparsely furnished, but a stack of papers on a kitchen counter caught her attention. She rifled through them, finding receipts, utility bills, and a handwritten note. "Livy loves the new school. She's happy here. I just hope we can stay this time." "She was here," Emily said, her voice shaking as she handed the note to Richard. He read the words, his throat tightening. "She was happy," he murmured. "She was safe." Emily turned to him, her face determined. If she was safe here, then why did they leave? Richard shook his head, his mind racing. Helen must have felt threatened again. Whoever was after Olivia didn't stop. They continued searching the house, finding little else of value, but the note confirmed one crucial fact. Helen and Olivia had lived there together, even if only briefly. The trail was growing warmer. Back in the car, Richard called James, updating him on the latest discovery. "The trail is leading us from one place to another, but we're always a step behind. I need more on Helen. Any recent sightings? Anything that suggests where she might have gone?" "I'm working on it," James assured him. "But if Helen's still trying to stay hidden, it won't be easy. I'll dig deeper." Richard ended the call, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Emily placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "We're getting closer," she said softly. "We'll find her." Her words steadied him, and he nodded. "We have to." The next address in the notebook took them to a rural area in New Mexico. As they drove through the barren landscape, Emily flipped through the pages again, studying the notes Helen had left behind. "She kept mentioning someone," Emily said, her voice thoughtful. "Someone she was afraid of, but she never says who." Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly. "It has to be Robert. He's the only one with the resources and motive to track her." Emily hesitated. "But why? Why go to all this trouble to hide Olivia?" "Because Olivia is the key to everything," Richard said grimly. "She's the link between Margie, Robert, and Helen, and somewhere along the line she became a threat to someone." They arrived at the next location, a small farmhouse on the edge of a dusty plain. This time, the house wasn't abandoned. A light glowed in the front window, and Richard felt his pulse quicken. "This could be it," he said, his voice hushed. Emily nodded, her hand gripping the pendant around her neck. Together, they approached the house, their footsteps cautious. Richard knocked on the door, and the sound echoed in the stillness of the night. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an older woman with sharp eyes and a weary expression. She froze when she saw them, her gaze locking on Richard. "You're him," she said, her voice trembling. "You're her father." Richard's breath caught. "You know Olivia?" The woman nodded slowly. "She's here." The woman's words, "She's here," sent a jolt through Richard. For a moment, the world seemed to blur, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. Emily stood frozen beside him, clutching her pendant tightly as though it might anchor her to reality. "Olivia's here," Richard finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, her sharp gaze softening slightly. "Yes, my name is Helen. I've been looking after her all these years." Helen stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in. I think we have a lot to talk about." Richard and Emily exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The farmhouse was modest but warm, with worn furniture and the faint scent of baked bread lingering in the air. Photos lined the walls, many of them showing two girls growing up together. Emily and another girl Richard recognized immediately as Olivia. The sight of her smiling face, now older but unmistakably familiar, hit him like a wave. "She's not here right now," Helen said as if reading his thoughts. "She went into town, but she'll be back soon." Richard's chest tightened. The realization that he was mere moments away from seeing Olivia again felt almost too much to bear. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice trembling with equal parts urgency and restraint. Helen motioned for them to sit at the kitchen table, her hand steady as she poured tea into mismatched mugs. 15 years ago, Margie came to me with 2 little girls. She was terrified, said she couldn't keep them safe. One of them, she said, was being hunted by powerful people. I didn't ask questions. I just did what she asked. I took them in and hid them. "Why didn't you contact me?" Richard asked, his voice tight with emotion. "I've spent 15 years looking for Olivia." Helen met his gaze, her expression weary. "Margie told me you couldn't be trusted. She said the danger came from your family." Richard stiffened, anger flaring. "Robert, she meant Robert." Helen nodded slowly. "I didn't know the details, but I knew enough to stay away. I changed my name, moved from town to town, always staying one step ahead. Olivia grew up thinking I was her guardian. She never knew the truth." Richard leaned back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "And Emily?" he asked, turning to look at her. "You were with Olivia all this time." Emily's face was pale, her expression unreadable. "I don't remember much from when I was little. I thought Helen was my family." "You both were," Helen said firmly. "I did my best to raise you, to keep you safe." Emily shook her head, her voice trembling. "But why lie? Why not tell us the truth?" Helen sighed, her shoulders slumping. "Because the truth wouldn't have kept you safe. The less you knew, the better." The sound of a car pulling into the driveway cut through the tense silence. Richard's heart leapt into his throat as Helen stood, glancing out the window. "She's back," Helen said softly. Richard rose from the table, his legs unsteady. Emily followed, her hands clenched at her sides. They moved toward the door as it opened, and there she was, Olivia. She stepped inside, a grocery bag in one hand, her face lighting up when she saw Helen. But the moment her gaze landed on Richard, she froze. Her chestnut hair framed her face, her features a striking mirror of the little girl Richard remembered, now older, more mature. But those eyes, those unmistakable eyes, brought him to the edge of tears. "Olivia," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. She frowned slightly, her gaze shifting between him and Emily. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" The words stung, but Richard forced himself to smile, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "You don't, but I've been waiting a long time to meet you." Helen stepped forward, her tone gentle. "Livy, this is Richard Thompson. He's your father." Olivia's eyes widened, the grocery bag slipping from her hand. "My father," she echoed, her voice barely audible. Richard took a tentative step closer. "Yes, I've been looking for you ever since you disappeared. I thought I lost you forever." Olivia's breath hitched, her hand flying to her chest as though trying to steady herself. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, that can't be. You're not my dad. Helen is. Helen raised you." "Yes," Richard said, his voice trembling. "But I am your father, and I've spent every day for the last 15 years searching for you." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she looked to Helen for confirmation. Helen nodded, her own eyes glistening. "It's true, Livy. Richard is your father." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Olivia's hands shook as she turned back to Richard. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" she asked, her voice breaking. "I tried," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I searched everywhere, followed every lead, but I never gave up. And now here you are." Emily stepped forward, her voice soft. "Olivia, I think we might be sisters." Olivia's gaze snapped to Emily, her confusion deepening. "Sisters. It's a long story," Emily said, managing a faint smile. "But I think we have a lot to figure out." The night stretched on as they talked, piecing together the fractured puzzle of their lives. Olivia's initial shock gave way to cautious curiosity, and she listened intently as Richard shared memories of her childhood and the years he'd spent searching for her. Emily added her own perspective, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions she felt. By the end of the night, Olivia's walls began to crack. She looked at Richard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can trust you yet, but I think I want to try." Richard smiled through his tears. That's all I've ever wanted. The next morning, the first rays of sunlight streamed through the farmhouse windows, casting a golden glow over the modest living room where Richard sat. He stared at the photograph of Olivia and Emily as children, his heart heavy with both joy and uncertainty. Olivia had agreed to talk, to try, but the gap of 15 years was a chasm that wouldn't be bridged overnight. The sound of soft footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Olivia stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was guarded, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "You're up early," Richard said, setting the photograph down. "So are you," Olivia replied, her tone cautious. She hesitated before taking a seat across from him. "I couldn't sleep." Richard nodded, understanding all too well. "There's a lot to process." Olivia studied him for a moment, her gaze searching. "Helen always told me my parents, that they didn't want me, that I was safer with her." Richard's breath caught, the pain of her words like a knife. "That's not true," he said softly. "I've spent every day searching for you, Olivia. You were never unwanted. You were my world." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Then why didn't you find me sooner? Why did I grow up thinking I had no one?" Richard leaned forward, his voice trembling with emotion. "Because someone took you from me. I don't know all the details yet, but I believe Helen and Margie thought they were protecting you. From my family, from danger. They didn't understand how much I loved you." Olivia looked down, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. "It's hard to believe. I've only ever known Helen as my family." "I understand," Richard said, his voice steady, "and I'll never ask you to forget her. She kept you safe, and for that, I'm grateful. But I hope you'll let me be part of your life now." Olivia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, her expression unreadable. "Maybe," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I just need time." Richard nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Take all the time you need, I'll be here." Meanwhile, Emily had stepped outside to the porch, the crisp morning air helping to clear her mind. The revelations of the past few days weighed heavily on her, but something about the stillness of the countryside brought a sense of calm. Helen joined her moments later, carrying 2 steaming mugs of tea. "Mind if I sit?" Helen asked, her voice gentle. Emily shook her head. "Of course not." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of birds chirping filling the space between them. Finally, Emily spoke. "Why didn't you tell us the truth, Helen? About who we were?" Helen sighed, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Margie believed you both were in danger, and I trusted her. I thought keeping you in the dark would protect you. But it didn't," Emily said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It just left us with more questions." Helen nodded slowly. "You're right. And I'm sorry, Emily. I thought I was giving you and Olivia a chance at a normal life." Emily stared at her pendant, the crescent moon glinting in the sunlight. "Do you think we can fix this? Me, Olivia, and Richard?" Helen placed a hand on her shoulder. "I think it'll take time, but you're stronger than you realize. Emily, if anyone can rebuild those bridges, it's you." Later that afternoon, Richard and Emily sat with Olivia at the kitchen table, the tension between them slowly easing. Olivia had begun asking questions, tentative but genuine, and Richard answered each one with patience and care. "What was I like as a kid?" Olivia asked, her tone softer now. Richard smiled, the memory warming his heart. "You were fearless," he said, "always climbing trees, running faster than I could keep up. You loved animals too, especially horses. We used to have to drag you out of the stables at night." Olivia's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I guess some things never change. I still love horses," Emily chimed in, her voice light. "Maybe you can teach me a thing or two. I've never even ridden one." Olivia glanced at her, the beginnings of a genuine smile forming. "Maybe I will." For the first time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope that they could build something new, a family united not by the absence of pain, but by the strength to overcome it. As evening fell, Helen approached Richard on the porch. She looked weary but resolute. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. Richard turned to her, his expression wary. "What is it?" "When Margie left Olivia with me, she warned me about Robert. Helen began. She said he was dangerous, that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. I think he knew Olivia was alive all along. I think he let you believe she was gone to keep control over everything. Richard's fists clenched, anger surging through him. Why would he do that? To hurt you, Helen said simply, and to protect himself. If Olivia's disappearance came to light, it would have unraveled everything he built. Richard's jaw tightened. Then it's time he answers for it. Helen nodded. Just be careful. Men like Robert don't go down without a fight. That night, as the stars blanketed the sky, Richard sat with Olivia and Emily under the open expanse. The three of them shared quiet moments, their laughter hesitant but real. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that the future might hold something brighter, and with Olivia and Emily by his side, he knew he would fight for it. The next morning, Richard woke before dawn, his resolve steeled for what lay ahead. The truth about Robert's role in Olivia's disappearance was a shadow over everything, one he could no longer ignore. Richard had spent years searching for Olivia, but now that she was found, he knew the battle wasn't over. Justice had to be served. He stood in the kitchen, his phone in hand, and dialed James. The investigator picked up quickly, his voice sharp and alert. "Richard, any updates?" "More than updates," Richard said, his tone firm. Helen confirmed it. "Robert knew Olivia was alive. He let me think she was gone to protect himself. He's been hiding behind lies for 15 years, and I want him held accountable." James paused, his voice cautious when he finally spoke. "That's not going to be easy. If Robert was careful, there won't be much of a paper trail. Then we'll dig deeper," Richard replied. "If there's any evidence tying him to Olivia's disappearance, or Margie's decisions, we'll find it. I'll start looking," James promised. "But be prepared for resistance. Men like Robert don't go down without a fight." Richard shared his plans with Helen, Emily, and Olivia over breakfast. Olivia listened intently, her expression unreadable as she absorbed the details of Robert's betrayal. When Richard finished, she sat back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly. "What happens if you can't prove anything?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Then I keep fighting," Richard said. "I've spent too long letting him control the narrative. It's time to take it back." Emily glanced at Olivia, her voice soft but firm. "You deserve the truth." "Olivia, we both do." Olivia looked between them, her defenses slowly crumbling. "All right," she said quietly. "What do you need me to do?" "Just be ready," Richard said. "This won't be easy, but we'll get through it together." The confrontation with Robert came sooner than expected. Richard had been gathering evidence with James's help when he received an unexpected call. Robert wanted to meet, on his terms. "He knows something's coming," Richard said as he ended the call. He turned to Helen, Emily, and Olivia, who had been waiting nearby. "This is it. He's trying to get ahead of us." Helen's face was grim. "Be careful, Richard. Robert won't play fair." "I don't expect him to," Richard replied. "But this time, he won't win." The meeting took place at Robert's estate, a setting as cold and imposing as the man himself. Richard arrived with Olivia and Emily by his side, their presence a quiet show of unity. Robert greeted them in the grand foyer, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't expecting you to bring company," Robert said, his voice laced with mock politeness. "They have every right to be here," Richard replied. "We're here for answers, Robert. No more lies." Robert's smirk faltered for a moment, before he motioned for them to follow him into his study. The room was as ostentatious as Richard remembered, with its dark mahogany shelves and oversized leather furniture. Robert poured himself a drink, his movements slow and deliberate. "So," Robert began, taking a seat behind his desk, "you've come to accuse me of... what, exactly?" "You know what?" Richard said, his voice sharp. "You've known Olivia was alive this entire time. You let me think she was gone, and you used Margie to cover your tracks." Robert's smirk returned, but there was no humor in it. "And what proof do you have of these wild claims?" "We have enough," Richard said, holding his ground. "Helen's testimony, Margie's notes. And if you think I won't take this to the authorities, think again." Robert's expression darkened, his mask of calm slipping. "You think you can ruin me?" "Richard, go ahead and try. But let me remind you, Margie was the one who took Olivia. Whatever happened after that was out of my hands. Olivia stepped forward, her voice trembling with anger. You let me grow up without a family, without knowing who I was. How could you do that? Robert's gaze flicked to her, and for a moment, there was something resembling regret in his eyes. I did what I thought was best. You don't understand the risks involved. No, Olivia said, her voice rising. You did what was best for you, not for me, not for Emily, and definitely not for my dad. Her words struck like a blow, leaving Robert momentarily speechless. Richard seized the moment, stepping closer. This ends now, Robert, he said. You've been running from the truth for 15 years, but it's over. I'm taking back what you stole. The fallout from the confrontation was swift. With James's help, Richard brought the evidence to light, exposing Robert's role in covering up Olivia's disappearance. Margie's notes, Helen's testimony, and years of deceit painted a damning picture. Robert's carefully constructed empire began to crumble, and the man who had once seemed untouchable was forced to face the consequences of his actions. For Richard, the victory was bittersweet. The truth had come at a cost, but it had also brought him closer to Olivia and Emily. Together, they began to rebuild, piece by piece. In the months that followed, the Thompson family found a new rhythm. Olivia moved back to California, choosing to stay close to Richard as they worked to bridge the gap of lost time. Emily stayed as well, her bond with Olivia deepening as they embraced their shared history. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them stood in the orchard, the golden light casting long shadows across the rows of trees. Olivia turned to Richard, her expression soft but resolute. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand everything that happened, she said, but I know one thing. I'm glad you never gave up. Richard smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. Neither did you, Livy, Emily chimed in, a playful grin on her face. And now you're stuck with me as your sister, Olivia laughed. The sound light and genuine. I think I can live with that. As they stood together, the weight of the past began to lift. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they faced it as a family, united by love, strengthened by truth, and ready for whatever came next.